everyone, and welcome to Mint Casts, our Mint Press podcast series. I'm Mnar Muhawesh, editor-in-chief of Mint Press, and I will be your host. Thanks again for joining today's conversation, where we will be discussing the Annual Defense Policy Bill, the National Defense Authorization Act, or better known as the NDAA. This piece of legislation, which most Americans don't even know exists, consists of vague language first seen in the 2012 NDAA that allows the U.S. government to unlawfully and indefinitely detain and even assassinate U.S. citizens, including journalists who associate or substantially support enemies of the U.S. such as al-qaeda. While indefinite detention and targeted assassinations of American citizens is nothing new, nor is allocating billions of dollars to the defense budget, 2011 was the first year where we saw the U.S. government legalize their ability to commit these crimes. Many in the journalism and civil liberties community have heard about the NDAA after a group of activists and journalists, including Noam Chomsky and Hedges, sued the Obama administration for that very vague language I mentioned and its implications. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court has said it won't hear the case, but the effort to bar the NDAA is far from over. In pioneering an effort to bring attention to this legislation, who is joining us today is founder of People Against the NDAA, or PANDA, Dan Johnson, who is working on a hyper-local level to pass legislation that would bar the U.S. government from detaining or assassinating American citizens in local communities across the nation. Well, thank you so much, Dan, for joining me today. It sounds like we're talking, like we're acting, like this sounds so ridiculous, but this is actually true, and it exists. This legislation does exist, and Dan, you just turned 21 this past week. Happy belated birthday.
Thanks.
Thank you. And you actually founded PANDA when you were 18. Can you tell me how someone so young got involved into bringing attention to a piece of legislation that, let's face it, most Americans haven't even heard of?
Well, I have to attribute a lot of that to homeschooling. I was homeschooled by my parents growing up, and I got to study pretty much whatever I wanted. I got to choose the path that I wanted to study. I ended up studying the rise and fall of the Third Reich, ended up studying the rise and fall of Imperial Japan, and even what we did. It was a book called Rising Suns, and it chronicled what we did in the United States to the Japanese Americans during World War II, when we detained 110,000 Japanese Americans without charge or trial. Growing up with that and knowing history could repeat itself really laid the groundwork. So when, even though I wasn't paying any attention, I supported the Patriot Act, I supported Bush wholeheartedly, I supported everything that had an R next to it of any kind. And when I came across a video online back in 2011, this is during fall when the Senate was actually debating the NDAA, of 2012, it said 61 senators betrayed you today. And so I'm thinking, 61 senators betrayed me today? That's not right. Obama's the only thing wrong with this country. So is there 61 Democrats in the Senate? Really? But then I decided to watch the video, and I remember staring at my computer screen in absolute and utter shock that this could possibly be happening in the United States, that the NDAA actually allowed the military to operate on U.S. soil in violation of the Pars Comitatus Act, in violation of long-standing principle that when the military becomes the police, they abuse their power, that they would actually allow the military to go after, detain, and execute American citizens without a charge, without a trial, without a day in court, without an attorney. It was shocking. I knew history repeated itself. I mean, this is essentially identical to the 1933 Decree for the Protection of People and State of the Third Reich, otherwise known as the Reichstag Fire Decree. It's pretty much identical. And I couldn't believe this is happening in America. This is America, the land of the free, the home of the brave, the Star-Spangled Banner, and we are free to do whatever we want. We're free to associate with whoever we want. We're free to. And then I realized that they are putting in the last phase for a police state in this country. And could you really sit down? I mean, what would you do if you think about what are you going to say to a 6-year-old when she looks you in the eyes and asks you, what did you do? Because her mom was taken by the government for espousing anti-government views. Because that happened in Czechoslovakia. That happened in Ukraine. That happened in Russia. That happened in North Korea. That happens in North Korea. what would your response be? And I didn't want my response to be, well, I didn't do anything.
Well, that's amazing, and especially for someone who's so young, pioneering this type of activism. And you mentioned that you were very Republican. You had a very Republican background. How involved you had been, or maybe your family had been previously in politics?
We talked about politics often at the dinner table. It was a topic of discussion. It was something my parents wanted to bring me up on. I was told a lot that we need you to get involved in politics, get involved. I was actually planning on working for the Newt Gingrich campaign when I... God, I think about it, so funny right now. I planned on working for the Newt Gingrich campaign that year when I was in college to get a little bit of experience. I planned on interning at the Ohio House of Representatives to get some experience. And I really didn't want to get terribly involved in it until after college. But my family, besides talking about politics around the dinner table and keeping a lively discussion about it, never really got seriously engaged. And however, they did tell me, put up or shut up. If you're going to complain about it and you're not going to do anything about it, quit complaining about it and go sit back down because you're not doing anything. So that kind of mentality, plus they said, we'll support you. Whatever you do, we'll support you, even if we disagree, even if we agree with you, whatever. We will support you, and you can change the world. And like that, I mean, if you go to find my personal Facebook, it's facebook.com/changetheworld. I really looked for ways to change the world, and when this came about, there really isn't much of a world left to change when your government claims the authority to kill you without trial.
Could you tell me why the American public should be concerned with the NDAA?
Well, the number one reason the American public, at least in my opinion, should be concerned about the NDAA is because of its historical precedent, because of how the power has been used before. This exact same power has been applied across the country twice. The first time was in 1862. Abraham Lincoln signed Executive Order, or signed Proclamation 94. This proclamation essentially said that he suspended habeas corpus in the country, which most people know, but also that any person found disloyal to the northern government will be placed in military jurisdiction. He detained 15,000 northerners and executed most of them. And the Supreme Court said, well, wait a second. They said in Ex parte Milligan that the Constitution is a rule for both war and in peace and protects men and rulers, and that any of its provisions could be suspended during the great exigencies of government is a doctrine leading directly to anarchy and despotism. That's from the Supreme Court. So they really saw the abuse of the laws of war and the application of a battlefield concept to America as a bad idea. But of course we didn't learn. And so on February 21st, 1942, a day that even beyond Pearl Harbor will live in infamy, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which essentially said certain coastal areas of the country are to now be controlled by the military. It said nothing about imprisonment, said nothing about detention. It said certain coastal areas of the country will be controlled by the military, and then we detain 110,000 Japanese Americans. Those two are the exact same authority in the 2012 NDAA. In fact, on the lawsuit you talked about, the families of the Japanese Americans who were detained, those families were actually amici on the suit. So they said, this is dangerous. This is the exact same authority. So is it 1.1 million this time? I mean, when they filed the lawsuit, when the Freedom 7 activists filed the lawsuit, the government's first argument was not, we can't do this to you, which you would expect from a benevolent government, that their first argument would be, well, no, this doesn't apply to you. Their first argument was, it already applied to you under the authorization for use of military force, so why are you challenging the NDAA? There's already another law that covers that. And so when we look at the abuse, what happens when the military becomes the law enforcement, heck, look at the Posse Comitatus Act. The Posse Comitatus Act, known by many Americans as prohibiting the military from being used as law enforcement on U.S. soil, was put in place because after the Civil War, during the Reconstruction era, the military in the South was preventing blacks from voting, enforcing strict segregation, and allowing slave owners and plantation owners to get away with anything they wanted as far as breaking the law was concerned. So every time we've given the military widespread control over this country, it has led to a civil rights disaster Do we want that again with the 2012 NDAA, especially when the Obama administration and the Bush administration claimed they had this power without the law anyway?
So considering this has, been part of our history, obviously, how is this a violation of our Constitution?
It's a violation of our Constitution in so many ways that I couldn't even count that. Actually, we have counted, and there are 14 provisions of the Constitution violated by the 2012 NDAA, including over half the Bill of Rights, 6 amendments. The 1st, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 8th, and 10th. So we already have over half the Bill of Rights violated by the 2012 NDAA Section 1021 and 1022 because they're so vague. But we have to remember that the law of war does not respect the Constitution. The law of war is international laws of war. So let me walk, if we have a second, let me walk your listeners through the history of the law of war. The law of war was put forth at Geneva Conventions, and what it did was it defined the rules for international warfare between countries. So there were 2 categories defined. Number 1 was combatant, enemy combatant. This means you had a gun, you had a flag, you had a command structure. Number 2 was non-combatant. This means you didn't have any of those. So when the United States saw these 2 categories put in place, they were fine with it until 9/11, because both categories prohibit torture and both categories prohibit execution. They provide what's called prisoner of war protections. You are a POW. We have to treat you a certain way. So the United States Justice Department, under the Bush administration, created a new category out of thin air and called it unlawful enemy combatant, which means you have all the pains and penalties of the laws of war, but none of the protections. They then used this category to torture the alleged 9/11 hijackers in Guantanamo Bay. And then in 2009, Congress went, well, we could only detain combatants and strip all of their POW rights. We want to go after people sitting in a cafe, too. So they passed the 2009 Military Commissions Act, which changes the definition now from unlawful enemy combatant to unprivileged enemy belligerent, which takes away the combatant requirement. You no longer have to take up arms against anyone. You can just be belligerent, whatever that is. And they use this category to execute 5 American citizens, including a 16-year-old, in Yemen, in separate drone strikes. 5 of them. It wasn't just one drone strike, we accidentally killed a few. It was 5 American citizens in separate drone strikes killed in Yemen under this category. Why do you think the term belligerent act is in the 2012 NDAA? Because it directly refers to unprivileged enemy belligerent. So a category, to recap, a category created to torture, used to execute, now applies to every single American citizen anywhere in the world and any person on U.S. soil. That is the danger of the 2012 NDAA. We're not making up something out of thin air. We're looking at historical precedent that says every single time this has been used, it's violated someone's civil rights. And that's the dangers of putting the law of war on U.S. soil. There is no Constitution. Forget it.
Sure, sure. And my next question is, considering everything you just said, how does this affect journalism? Number 1, and then the second question I have is, in terms of those who speak up and call out the U.S. government for maybe their drone strikes. I mean, does this affect those people?
Well, the fun part about 2012 NDAA is it can. It is optional. So when Congress and when the Senate Intelligence Committee gives arms to Syrian rebels in the al-Nusra faction of al-qaeda, which is direct support to al-qaeda and therefore punishment under the NDAA, no one goes after them because it's optional. So number 1, it's optional. But were that option to be used, journalist Chris Hedges, who led the lawsuit against the NDAA, testified in court that he has not written articles because he could be detained under this law. How powerful of a statement is that for journalists? He has refused to write articles, not for a small newspaper, for the New York Times. He's refused to write articles for the New York Times and for Truthdig because he could be detained under the NDAA. That is a chilling effect on free speech. That's a chilling effect on journalism. It's exactly what Judge Catherine Forrest said in the district court. And how could this affect other people? The term that is used under the 2012 NDAA is vaguely referring to terrorism, so terrorists. Well, who is considered a terrorist today? According to the UK government, when they went after David Miranda, who many of you remember was the partner of Glenn Greenwald, they filed documents in court that if your actions affect the course of a government, it's terrorism. The United States government is a little less ridiculous, but if you look at the Department of Homeland Security START report published 31 days after the 2012 NDAA was signed into law, called Hotspots of U.S. Terrorism, which is predicting the next wave of terrorism in the United States, that report said, and I quote, "Groups or individuals who are reverent of individual liberty, suspicious of centralized federal authority, and believe in conspiracy theories that involve grave threat to national sovereignty and or personal liberty are, end quote, are considered the next terrorist threat." Does that apply to people who speak out against the government? I would say yes. And if it doesn't, for some reason, we have 500 other definitions on our website at pandaunite.org under who is a terrorist, in which I'm sure many of you can fit under, from paying with cash to refusing to give out identification. Plenty of you could fall under the terrorism mantra.
Sure. Well, that sounds like it's a very big threat to our First Amendment rights, which protects our free speech, and our press, because the whole role of journalism in general, at its essence, is to hold those in power accountable. So tell me a little bit more about how PANDA works, and what are your goals, and how do you consider yourself a grassroots organization?
Sure. Well, I guess you could define grassroots. We started on a laptop in my dorm room, so I guess that's as grassroots as it gets. But
right?
Yeah, I think you don't get much more grassroots than that. But we have since expanded, and what we are today, we were the largest organization in America, taking on the NDAA back in October. And then in order to get rid of the bureaucracy, because time is of the essence here, we decided to decentralize. And now we are activist trainers. So what we do is, I am obviously, and you are obviously, concerned about fighting for our liberty, making sure there is freedom in the future, making sure there is peace, making sure there is a world where our children would want to grow up in. I am happy to train anyone who is also concerned, and we are happy to train anyone who also wants to take on tyranny and fight for their liberty and fight for their children's future, but we won't do the work for you. Because if we do, then we're just wasting our time, because you don't actually want your liberty and want your freedom. So what we are, we're activist trainers. If you want to take back your town, or you want to ban the NDAA, or you want to stop indefinite detention in your community, we help you get moving. If you don't, there are 20 other people who do. So, I mean, the American Revolution was an unpopular revolution. There were less than 3% of the country actually fought. Of those, the true Sons of Liberty split from the Sons of Liberty, and so you probably had less than 1% that actually ended up founding the nation. And a third of the country were Tories, which means they would have turned any of the Founding Fathers in at a moment's notice. So, if that was an unpopular revolution and worked, I figure a well-organized, unpopular revolution here could work again against the NDAA, and it seems to actually be working. So what we do is, on a local level, we first help people put in legislation to ban not only the NDAA, but the laws of war. They didn't have the NDAA when they detained 110,000 Japanese Americans. They had the same power, they called it a different name. So we're going after the root of the power, which is the laws of war. You can't use the military to go after any person, because I don't see anywhere in my Bill of Rights that says citizen. Nowhere. Don't see it, because if it did, it would mean government gave us rights, because without government there is no citizens. So we're going after persons, but we help them put legislation in place, we help them change police policy, so that if a police officer in that jurisdiction knowingly allows these provisions to be used, they'll be fired from their job, which puts the best barrier in place of all. Because when a man finds it difficult to understand something, when his job depends on him not understanding it. And when the police officer's job depends on him refusing the military access to a person in that city or in that county, they're much more likely to do it. And then finally, we help them set up a citizen's watch. So we work at this on a grassroots level because this is a systemic problem. This was brought out to me. The NDAA got my attention. But It's a systemic problem. It's been in the United States throughout history. We've used the military more times than I can count. Widespread, we've used it twice already. So we want to go after the systemic problem at the root of it. And in order to do that, we're going to have to go at the grassroots level. You imagine government corruption as a pyramid. And at the top of the pyramid, you have whoever has the money. So follow the money. Below that, you have the federal government, then you have the state government, then you have local government. If you go knock off the top of the pyramid, all somebody has to do is exactly what they did in Egypt. They deposed Mubarak, the top of the pyramid, and then somebody walked up and placed Morsi on there. And then they deposed Morsi at the top of the pyramid, and then somebody walked up and placed, I believe it was General al-Sisi on there. And so you have this continual, we're going to go to the top and we're going to fix things, but the entire bottom is still corrupt. So we pull brick by brick by brick out of the bottom of that pyramid, and you reach 51%, and that entire pyramid, that entire house of cards will fall. That's why we work at a local level. That's why we encourage people to work at a local level, is because that is where the lasting change, not just law change, but the lasting change to make sure there is a future for children in this country, the lasting change is at the local level.
So it sounds like you guys have been hard at work, and you've actually been very successful. Tell me about the 5 cities that you've been able to pass legislation in.
Well, obviously we have been very successful because since you and I have chatted, we got another one.
Oh.
So we're actually up to 6 now. And thank you. It was through the great efforts of the Massachusetts resistance. They did a really good job, and they have they're neck and neck with Idaho now. Idaho has 1 county and 2 cities, and Massachusetts has 3 towns. So Rutland, Massachusetts is the most recent. We started in Albany, New York, the capital of New York, passed our resolution, which applies the Constitution to the laws of war. And as the Supreme Court put it, when the Constitution applies to the laws of war lose. They cannot exist. So they passed what we call the Restoring Constitutional Governance Resolution. That was written up by the Patriot Coalition, and we utilize it because it's a very good piece of legislation. Albany first, then it was Webster, Massachusetts, and Oxford, Massachusetts, and then Middleton, Idaho, Emmett, Idaho, rather, followed by Middleton, Idaho, followed by Gem County, Idaho, and now we have Rutland. We have currently, at my last count, and it's hard to tell because we're decentralized and people don't report to us. Basically, it just happens. Like, I found out about Rutland through an email. So it just kind of happens, which is cool, which is really good because I only have 24 hours in a day. But we have about 100 cities or so that are currently being worked on. In fact, last night there was a city council meeting in Alaska, which people were at, and in a couple days there will be a city council meeting somewhere in Massachusetts. So we are working to train people, and people have taken to the training well, and they've decided that this is worth their liberty, worth their freedom, and there's about 100 cities currently working on banning it. At this rate, we'll reach the 50% threshold here in a couple of years.
And I believe the 10th Amendment Center has been responsible for also passing similar kinds of legislation, but more on a state and national level. What is your view on that kind of legislation? Because I know you talked a lot about, this grassroots movement and, pulling those bricks from the very bottom. How do you feel about this legislation on a national level?
Well, first of all, taking national and taking state and then going after the specific piece of legislation you're talking about. Legislation at a national level is nice, but we already sent reparations to all the Japanese Americans we detained, or the families of the Japanese Americans, $600 apiece. We sent reparations to them as a sorry for detaining you, we won't do it again. That was a law passed on the national level, I believe, in the 1970s. Well, if that law was passed on the national level just not too long ago, and we already have it back, how well do laws on the national level work? They don't. We go to the state level. Well, you think about the state level, proportionate to how many people you govern is a pretty good ratio of what your power is. So back during the colonial period, where we had rampant corruption already at the state or at the national level, there was about 11 to 13 million people in the country when the Constitution was first put in place. There are 11 million people in Ohio, which means the state government, just by virtue of how many people they govern, is basically a federal government, and the federal government is basically a super federal government. So the state government, can you watch them? Are you sitting in, if it's Ohio, are you sitting in Columbus right now? Are you watching your state legislatures? Can you keep an eye on your state police? Can you? No, of course not. And ultimately, it's going to be up to the people to defend their rights. So we will work with states from time to time to help them push legislation. We had legislation in Arizona last year, and we did work with states for a while, but the fact of the matter is, if we're just going to put a false sense of security forth to the American people, then yeah, let's do it at the state and national level, because that changes the law. But I don't care about the law. I care about the action behind it. I don't care if they cite the Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, or the NDAA. If they use this action, it is wrong on a human level. And so we need to prevent the action, and that's why we push for local level legislation. The third point, on the actual pieces of legislation that have been promoted, we follow a strategy that Ben Franklin advocated, which was criticize in private, praise in public. However, the pieces of legislation passed by the state level are so ridiculous that we had to issue analysis, and in fact, we have an analysis of every single piece of state legislation that has been passed and signed by the governor. We have an analysis of Michigan, we have an analysis of Virginia, analysis of California. Basically, they are false senses of security. California's, which was really praised, was so bad that we actually nicknamed it Swiss cheese run through an electric drill. So that's why one of the reasons we don't rely on the state legislature as well.
So Dan, can you tell me what's next for PANDA?
What's next for us is we're going to continue training people who want to be trained. We're continue helping people who want to be helped. We're continue providing resources to any person in the United States who wants to take on the NDAA and the laws of war until we've completed our mission, which is to stop this practically from happening in the United States. I wish we could take care of international warfare as well. There are American citizens abroad who should not have been assassinated. It is a huge undertaking to take on anything international. So we are currently not big enough for that. So our focus is the United States. But what is next for us? We will continue doing this, stopping the police are being militarized. The police are already becoming bad enough. Imagine what happens when you take an officer and he doesn't have a Glock anymore. He now has a tank. He doesn't have a squad car anymore. He now has a rocket launcher. That kind of power differential really ends up hurting civil rights. We saw it in Watertown. In Watertown, Massachusetts, we saw that the military locked down that city. What happened? People were dragged out of their home at gunpoint. Bullets were fired at random. Every house was searched. I mean, you had snipers on the rooftops. What were they They were searching for a teenage boy who later turned out to be unarmed. Even if he was, do you really need 5,000 officers and searching for a teenage boy, even if he is armed with a pistol? So this is what happens. The military does not take a calm and careful approach to things. They take a brute force approach. And so we want to draw the line in the sand there. If we can draw, if the American people have enough guts to draw the line in the sand at military, then we can work on keeping the police accountable. And then we can work on all these other things. But if you can't even draw your line when the government claims the authority and uses the authority to kill you, where else are you going to draw your line? I don't think there is anywhere else. So it's a test for America right now to see, is this enough? Will you draw your line here? And will you stop it?
So I know that you mentioned before that you go and train citizens on this issue, but how do people get involved how do people get involved with your organization or with your effort?
So the organization is just a couple small staff and like a representative in different states. But as far as the resistance, which we really encourage people to get involved with, the resistance is the decentralized movement. So you go on our website, which is pandaunite.org/takeback. There's a packet there. You don't have to put your email in. You don't have to put anything in. There's a packet there of information. There's a resolution. Everything you need is you'll never have to talk to me if you don't want to. Everything you need is literally on the website. Now, I'm a cool guy to talk to, but at least I think. But you never have to talk to me if you don't want to. Everything's on the website. And if you want, there's a little form that says ask for help. And you can ask us for help. And then we'll reach back out and we'll help you get going in your community. everything is, we don't have to run through bureaucracy. We don't have to run, because it just slows everything down, and Liberty right now has to move fast. So everything is on the website for someone who wants to join the resistance. And even if you don't want to actually take specific action in your community to pass a law or what have you, every time you spray paint NDAA on your car, every time you print up a t-shirt, every time you print up a sign, every time you go protest, every time you spread the word, if you just told one person a week about the NDAA, and 1,000 people are doing that, and then another 1,000 people, you have a rippling effect that we could educate 100,000 people a week on the NDAA. I mean, being a part of the NDAA resistance just means I'm going to do what I can to educate, and I'm going to do what I can to take action and make sure it doesn't happen in my community.
Well, great, and it's very interesting that you called it the resistance. So thank you so much, Dan, for joining me today. It's always a pleasure. So the fight continues, right? You can find this podcast through our Mint Press iTunes channel and on our website, but the conversation is far from over, as we'd like to hear more from our readers and listeners on the subject of the NDAA and what concerns you have for the implications of the vague language we just discussed. Tweet at us using hashtag MintCasts and tell us what you think. You can also post on our Facebook page in our comments section to our pinned post featuring this podcast. Thank you so much for listening.